Elliott Abrams. Elliott Abrams was just made not our ambassador to Venezuela, but the person within the Trump crime regime that would handle U.S. policy toward Venezuela. Big, horrible, horrible mistake. First of all, you have to understand Elliott Abrams' role during the Reagan years. Let me give you an example. On December 10th, 1981, as the U.S.-trained Atlacatl Battalion arrived at the village of El Mozote in El Salvador to slaughter nearly 1,000 civilians, including children, President Ronald Reagan posed for a photo with Elliott Abrams and his parents, his wife, and his son in honor of Human Rights Day. Then the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs, Abrams, was distinguished in Washington as an expert at lying in the name of freedom. At the United Nations on Saturday, Jorge Arreaza, the Venezuelan representative, called the U.S., quote, the vanguard of the coup d'etat, when Juan Guaido declared himself interim president with the support of the United States. And as Truthdig reports this, newly appointed by the State Department as the head of the, quote, efforts to restore democracy, end quote, in Venezuela, Abrams responded by criticizing President Nicolás Maduro. Abrams said, quote, democracy never needs to be imposed. It is tyranny that needs to be imposed. Now, scores of people have been killed by Venezuelan security forces in the past week, according to anti-Maduro activists. Abrams was previously appointed to be Deputy Secretary of State, but Trump said no. After Abrams wrote a negative piece about Trump in 2016, it was entitled, quote, when you can't stand your candidate, end quote. And now Abrams is poised to revisit a playbook of distortion that has only grown in the 3 decades since he left the State Department. He is a 70-year-old convicted war criminal. And he has an extensive record of lies and policy ideas that prioritize secret U.S. military involvement, particularly, if not singularly, in Latin America. This is an evil fucker. This guy is drenched in the blood of innocent people. In 2002, as senior director of the National Security Council in the Bush White House, Abrams encouraged an attempted coup in Venezuela against then-President Hugo Chavez. Now, after that massacre in El Mozote, El Salvador, 1981, Abrams went to great lengths to try to convince the Senate committee in February 1982 that reports of that slaughter of 1,000 men, women, and children were, in Abrams' words, not credible. Despite photographs of the dead and eyewitness testimony, he argued that the front page stories at the time in the New York Times and the Washington Post, written by U.S. journalists, guided by Salvadoran rebels, Abrams said those articles reporting on the slaughter were propaganda. At the time, Abrams said, quote, "It appears to be an incident that is at least being significantly misused, at the very best, by the guerrillas." In 1991, Abrams pleaded guilty to 2 misdemeanor counts for lying to Congress about using money from weapons sales to Iran-Contra, to fund the Contra rebels in Nicaragua. Now, this filthy bastard Abrams, always insisting on his innocence, called the legal proceedings against him as a result of the Iran-Contra affair. He called it Kafkaesque and abysmally stupid. Abrams was sentenced to 2 years of probation, 100 community service hours, only to be pardoned by Herbert Walker Bush a year later. Excuse me, got a tickle in my throat. Woo! Now, if you've been listening to me in my rantings and ravings over the years, you know I've said many times it's hard to quantify the extent of the destruction that the U.S. has participated in or facilitated in Latin America. The School of the Americas down the road here at Fort Benning, Georgia, has become notorious the world over for what we did there and continue to do there under a different name, and that is to train Central and South American militaries that are run by dictators how to torture, murder, disappear, terrorize a population to keep it absolutely under control so that U.S. corporations can continue to exploit the people and the nations of Central and South America. It's horrible. Like so much U.S. government policy has been horrifying. It's hard to quantify the extent of the destruction that is our responsibility, that we facilitated, caused, started, participated in, or trained the killers. El Mozote is considered the worst massacre in Latin American history. It's hardly the only time Abrams covered up for death squads. In Honduras, from 1981 to 1985, again during the Reagan years, the CIA trained Battalion 316, tortured and murdered suspected activist students and guerrillas who were fighting the dictatorship in Honduras. Now, this was at the time, by the way, when, I mentioned this before on the air, a friend of mine was in Honduras at the time, in Tegucigalpa, which is the capital. And just at the time, I had only recently begun doing radio. And when she came back, she said, you know, interesting thing I saw there at the airport in Tegucigalpa when she was leaving to come back to the States was an array of Israeli aircraft, you know, with the Star of David on the side, and it was very obvious that, now they were not military planes per se, they weren't fighters or bombers, they were transport planes. And that's an aspect of our terror activities in Central America that for some reason never gets mentioned, except by far-left writers who occasionally bring it up, that a lot of the torture techniques that were backed by the United States and used against people in Central and South America over the years, especially in the 80s, were the result, those techniques were the result of training by Israeli Mossad agents who use those techniques against Palestinians. Now, the U.S. couldn't openly send our military troops into Honduras. Some reporter would have asked questions. But the Israelis, they kept the blood off of our hands, so to speak. Anyway, CIA-trained Battalion 316 was one of the worst in Honduras. Abrams later said to defend our intervention there, quote, disappearing people, murdering people was not the policy of the United States, nor was it our policy to avert our eyes, end quote. Abrams is one of the most practiced and experienced liars in U.S. foreign policy ever. Trump is a liar, but he's a pitiable liar. He just lies about everything. Abrams lies about the murder and mayhem that he has been instrumental in promoting and sanctioning. In 1981 to 83, the U.S. provided military aid to Guatemala as the de facto president then, Efrain Rios Montt, carried out a genocide against the indigenous Ixtlilxochitl people. Rios Montt, who died last year, was convicted of genocide and crimes against humanity, sentenced to 80 years in prison. But it was Abrams who argued that lifting an embargo on military aid to Guatemala would help. He said, quote, the amount of killing of innocent civilians is being reduced step by step. The truth was it was being increased step by step. Now, the truth is there would be hundreds of U.S. officials who were complicit in this slaughter, various slaughters in Central America, and should be subpoenaed, called before a grand jury, and subjected to indictment, including this fucking monster Elliott Abrams. And the U.S. should be ready to extradite them to Guatemala to face punishment if the Guatemalan authorities were able to proceed with this, which they are not. Now, you hear about, you know, this ignorant savage Trump talking about the gangs that come from Guatemala. And you've heard me mention many times that the terror tactics used by the United States in our backing of dictator regimes in Central America especially resulted in those countries being unable to govern themselves. Not because they don't understand the principles of democracy. They do. But the United States never wanted democratic governments in Central America, nor South America for that matter, although the main concern was Central America. Once it became clear that Venezuela had more oil reserves than any place on earth, then the United States began a serious and deliberate pattern of disrupting the political system in Venezuela, no matter what the people decided. If the people decided they wanted social democracy, the United States was right there to blow it to pieces. If the United States were to send troops to intervene in Venezuela, I shudder to think what the result would be. Hi, Truth Seekers. Mike Malloy here. As you know, we've switched formats and are now broadcast exclusively on the Progressive Voices Network. So that means you get fewer program interruptions, no corporate commercials, and lots of profanity. But our format change also means some of our radio listeners no longer hear the program. It's been a while since I mentioned our podcasts, so you may have forgotten that there is a way to listen to this program anytime you need a good dose of screaming. Visit MikeMalloy.com and subscribe to our podcast. You have your choice. You can listen to the ranting with the audio podcast or listen and watch me lose control with a video podcast subscription. As a podcast subscriber, you can download the program to your mobile device and take me with you wherever you go. And if you have a friend who needs a dose of truth-seeking, you can give a gift subscription as well. That's MikeMalloy.com, and never miss a minute of the uncensored fun and frivolity.